The great chamber of Syraxis Prime was filled with the sound of nervous voices as the Galactic Council gathered under the tall dome of blue glass that shone with the light of distant stars, and every seat was taken as ambassadors from more than 40 species sat waiting for the main discussion to begin, because today the matter was about humans, and no one in that room wanted to admit how much fear that one word carried. The Threx Collective had sent their most experienced counselor named Laren, who sat with his wide eyes half closed as he watched the others whispering to each other. He knew what was coming, because he had warned them many times that humans would not stay silent forever on the opposite side of the hall. The silver-scaled delegate from the Coran Navy adjusted his robe and said that humanity had crossed the line when they refused to obey the Council's latest order, which demanded the dismantling of their border defenses near the Orion Gate. The order had been made to reduce tension after a minor trade conflict between human freighters and a Zarnak patrol ship, but instead of answering with calm words, the humans had cut off all contact. The last message had been short: the United Earth Government is suspending diplomatic activity. Until further notice, no one knew what that meant. But to most of the Council, it sounded like defiance. Ambassador Daniel Ross had been the human representative for almost 10 years, and many of the alien leaders respected him even if they did not trust him. When he left the Council building 2 weeks earlier without a word, it caused waves of confusion across the network. Some thought it was a protest. Some thought he had been recalled to Earth for reassignment. But when the human embassy lights went dark and the building was sealed with automated locks, the truth began to take shape. Humanity had walked away. Laren stood and spoke to the chamber in his soft voice, saying that the humans were an emotional species who often made quick decisions, but that they would come back because they always came back. But even he did not believe his own words. He remembered the first time humans joined the Council, and how eager they had been to learn the ways of the galaxy, how they had built trade routes and research stations and shared medicine and technology, and how they had done so with open hands and clear hearts. But that was before the Council began to limit their rights to explore beyond the borders, before they told humanity that expansion was a danger to balance and that all exploration had to be approved through bureaucratic chains. The humans accepted it at first. Then they began to push back, and now they were gone. President Nathan Briggs sat alone in his office on Earth, staring at a screen showing the last message from the Council. His advisors had left him for the night. The sky outside was dark and rain tapped softly on the window. The words of the message echoed in his mind as he read them again. The Council demands that human fleets be grounded and that military shipyards be monitored to ensure compliance. It was almost laughable. The arrogance, the presumption that humanity would submit to inspection by species who did not even understand what sacrifice meant. He turned off the screen and leaned back in his chair. He knew this silence from Earth would shake the Council, because they were used to humans trying to talk through everything. Humans always tried to make peace even when they were insulted or betrayed, because they believed peace was strength. But now that belief had changed. They had learned that peace without respect was nothing more than surrender. He whispered to himself that this time there would be no surrender. Far away on the human fleet ship, Horizon Dawn Commander Elise Carter stood on the observation deck with her hands behind her back. The stars stretched out before her like a silver ocean. Her second officer, Lieutenant Ryan Holt, joined her and asked if they would hear anything from the Council. Soon she shook her head and said they would hear nothing, and they would say nothing because silence was now their message. Ryan frowned and said he did not like the silence. It made him feel like something terrible was coming. She smiled faintly and said that maybe it already had. The ship was one of many assigned to the defense perimeter near the border. It was quiet, but it was not peace because every ship was ready. Every system was armed and every soldier knew that orders could change in seconds. Elise walked along the deck and looked at the flag of Earth painted on the hull below her. She thought of her father, who had been a diplomat long ago. He used to say that words were the best shield humanity ever had. She wondered what he would think now when words had failed and only silence remained. Back in the Council chamber on Syraxis Prime, chaos was spreading. Some delegates wanted to send a new envoy to Earth, while others demanded that the human border worlds be placed under surveillance. Admiral Sareth from the Coran Navy slammed his claws on the table and said that humans could not be trusted and that their fleets were growing too large. to ignore a representative from the Varn coalition, disagreed, saying that humans were emotional but not suicidal, and that they would never risk open war. Laren sat quietly listening because he knew both were wrong. Humans were not preparing for war, and they were not retreating. They were doing something the council could not understand. They were choosing independence. When the meeting ended, several delegates stayed behind, talking in low tones. Laren walked out into the long corridor where the artificial sky shone with faint stars, and he wondered if this was how empires began to fall. Not with fire or invasion, but with silence and pride. On Mars, the industrial colonies were alive with energy factories that had slowed down months ago, now ran at full power again. Workers assembled ship parts and engineers calibrated defense systems. There were no speeches, no celebrations, no propaganda, just quiet work. People knew something was changing. They did not call it war, but they prepared. For one anyway, in the streets of New Houston on Mars, a group of workers watched the news showing angry debates from the Galactic Council. One of them said that it was strange how they used to dream of joining the stars, and now they were preparing. To stand alone, another replied that maybe standing alone was the only way to stay free. They did not know if their words would ever reach Earth, but they did not need to because everyone already understood. In deep space at the edge of the Orion Gate, a small outpost sent its last transmission before going dark. The message was brief. It said that all human ships had been recalled and that the outpost would be vacated in 24 hours. When the Council scouts arrived days later, they found the place empty. The hangars were sealed. The data cores had been wiped and the power systems had been shut down. Even the stars seemed quieter in that place. The scouts sent their report back to Syraxis Prime, and the Council members read it. With unease, they had expected defiance, maybe a show of strength. But what they saw instead was withdrawal. The humans had simply turned away from the galaxy and taken their silence with them. Daniel Ross sat in a transport ship on his way back to Earth, looking out the viewport at the swirling lights of the jump corridor. He thought about the years he had spent arguing for peace, sitting in those marble halls, trying to explain to beings older and wiser than him that humanity only wanted fairness. He thought about the endless debates about trade and exploration, and how every time humanity achieved something new, someone tried to limit it. He wondered when diplomacy had become another word for control, and when peace had become another form of surrender. When the ship came out of jump near the moon, he saw the distant blue curve of Earth below him. He closed his eyes and whispered that maybe walking away was the most human thing they could do, because sometimes to keep your soul, you had to let go of the table. And so the humans withdrew their voices from the stars, while the rest of the galaxy waited in fear and confusion, not realizing that this quiet was more dangerous than any weapon, because when humans stopped talking, the universe had learned that something was very wrong, and the Council felt that truth pressing down on them like the cold silence of space. And for the first time in centuries, they began to understand what it meant to lose the one species that always believed in peace and yet was never afraid of the storm. Commander Elise Carter stood in the command room of the Horizon Dawn and looked at the calm stars beyond the wide glass panels around her. The hum of the ship was steady, and the quiet sound of machines filled the air. Her crew moved with focus. Around their consoles, their faces showing discipline, mixed with something deeper, something like patience mixed with fear. The silence from Earth had lasted for weeks, and not a single message had been received from the Galactic Council, not even a warning or a threat. That silence was heavy like a fog, and it made every man and woman on that ship think about what was coming. Elise knew that silence was not peace, but a test, and she felt the weight of that silence every time she gave an order. The humans had decided to stop talking, and now the galaxy waited for their next move. She walked toward her seat, and her eyes met Lieutenant Ryan Holt, who was busy checking the ship sensors. He said softly that there was still no signal from the Council, and she nodded, saying that there would be none until Earth decided otherwise. He asked her if she thought this was the right thing to do. She told him that sometimes silence spoke louder than words, and that humanity had said too many words. For too many years, Ryan sighed and said that he missed the days when the Council chambers were full of noise and laughter, and Elise smiled faintly and said that noise and laughter were easy when people did not feel fear. The bridge grew quiet again, and the stars outside seemed to listen. On Earth, President Nathan Briggs stood before a small group of advisors in a dimly lit room. Maps and reports covered the large table in front of them. He told them that the council was already in panic, though they would never admit it. He said that they depended on human trade, on human technology, on the stability that humans brought into the system. He said they would feel the loss soon. The advisors nodded. But one of them, an older man named Alan Pierce, asked what if they decided to use force. Briggs looked at him and said that humanity was ready. They would defend themselves if needed, but they would not start anything. They had tried to be peaceful for too long, and now it was time to let the galaxy understand what respect meant. He said that the council would soon realize that without humanity, the balance would fall, because humans were the glue that held so many things together. Alan Pierce said that it sounded risky, and Briggs answered that freedom was always risky. On Mars, life moved in strange rhythm. The factories worked night and day building parts for ships and defense systems. The workers did not talk much. They worked in silence. They knew what the silence from Earth meant, and they accepted it as a sign of strength. People remembered how humans had been treated at the council, always seen as the younger race, always told to wait, always told to obey. Now they were doing the opposite, and it felt strange but right. In one small home near the shipyard, a young woman named Karen sat with her little brother and told him stories about the time when the first humans joined the council. She said that back then, everyone thought the galaxy would become one family, and that humans believed in it with all their hearts. But she said sometimes families only want control and not love. Her brother asked if that meant humans were bad, and she said no. It meant humans had learned when to walk away. Far away in council space, the ambassadors gathered again on Syraxis Prime. The room was filled with tension more than before because every report they received from human space was the same. No response, no communication, no trade ships, no ambassadors. The council leader, a tall figure named Zorak of the Valar Dominion, slammed his hand on the table and said that this silence was dangerous. He said that humans were planning something. The others argued. Some said humans would never risk war. Some said they had already declared it with their silence. Laren from the Threx Collective spoke and said that humans were unpredictable, that they felt deeply and that they never forgot insult or kindness. He said the council had treated them as children, and now those children had grown and decided to leave. Another counselor asked if he was afraid. Laren said he was not afraid of humans. He was afraid of what the galaxy would become without them. The meeting went on for hours, and finally they decided to send another envoy, someone neutral, someone the humans might still listen to. Captain Mara Ellis was chosen. She was not human, but had once worked with human fleets during the early years of diplomacy. She understood their ways and their stubbornness. She agreed to go, though she knew it was dangerous. She left the council building quietly and walked toward her ship, thinking about what she would say if she reached them. She remembered how humans smiled when they built something new, how they laughed even when they failed. She did not believe they were a threat. She believed they were hurt and tired of being controlled. She told her second officer that maybe all they needed was time. But deep down, she wondered if time had already run out. In deep space, the Horizon Dawn received a coded transmission from the Fleet Command. Elise opened it and read the short message. It said, "Maintain silence. Continue observation. No contact authorized." She stared at the words for a long moment, and then closed the screen. Ryan asked if it was from Earth, and she said yes, and that the order was the same: silence, no movement, no reply. He said it felt like waiting for a storm, and she answered that sometimes storms were needed to clean the air. He said he did not understand humans sometimes, and she said that was all right because most of the time humans did not understand themselves either. They both smiled faintly and went back to their work. The hum of the ship filled the air again, and the stars shone like cold witnesses of everything that was happening. Days passed and the silence grew heavier across the galaxy. Merchants complained that trade routes were closing. Planets that relied on human supply lines began to suffer. Small conflicts started between council members as they argued over resources. Everyone felt the absence of the humans, even those who had disliked them before. In one report, it was written that the loss of human cooperation had caused more damage to the galactic economy than any war in the past century. But no one dared to say that aloud because it would mean admitting that the humans were too important. Zorak read that report in private and crushed it in his claws. He said to himself that the humans would come back, begging, but he did not sound sure. Meanwhile, Captain Mara Ellis reached the human border world of Titan Reach. It was once a busy trade station. Now it floated quiet and empty. Her crew scanned the surface and found no life signs. Only buildings without, power and landing pads covered in dust. She ordered her ship to send a greeting signal, and there was no answer. They waited for hours, still nothing. Then they picked up a faint transmission somewhere near the dark side of the planet. It was human, code but encrypted in a way their systems could not read. She told her crew to trace it, and they found it coming from orbit. She turned her eyes to the stars and gasped. Hundreds of human ships were uncloaking around them, one by one, silent and motionless. Her first officer asked if they should raise shields. She said no. They have not attacked us, they are just watching. She opened the communication channel and said that she came in peace, and that the council only wanted to talk. No answer came back. Only the quiet presence of human ships filling the sky like shadows. She said softly to herself that maybe they are not listening anymore. Maybe they are done talking. Back on Syraxis Prime. The council waited for her report. When it arrived, the room fell silent. Laren read it carefully and then placed it on the table. He said that the humans had spoken without saying a word. He said that they had chosen distance, and that the council should think about what that meant. But Zorak shouted that they must prepare their fleets because humans were planning war. Laren looked at him and said maybe the war has already been lost without a single shot being fired, because when a species that believes in peace decides to stop talking, the galaxy should tremble, because that silence means the time for lessons is over. The others looked at him and said nothing, because deep down they knew he was right. The galaxy had become quieter, but that quiet was full of tension, as if every star had stopped breathing. Council intelligence networks were running without rest, as they searched for any trace of human activity. But what they found only made the fear-stronger ships gone missing stations shut down entire colonies on the edge of human space. No longer responding, Admiral Sereth of the Coran Navy stood before the council table with reports in his hands. His dark eyes glowed under the light, and his voice was sharp. He said that humans were not retreating, they were preparing, and that anyone who believed otherwise was blind. The council leader, Zorak, hit the table and said they had no proof, only rumors. Sereth raised his voice and said that the humans had never gone silent like this unless something big was coming. He said their fleets were moving and their signals were hidden. Laren of the Threx Collective said that humans did not move without reason, and that maybe they were protecting themselves, not attacking. Zorak called him a fool, and said that protection and attack were the same thing when humans were involved. The chamber filled with angry voices, and the translator drones struggled to keep up as words flew across. The air filled with fear and pride. When the meeting ended, the council decided to send more scouts to human borders and to prepare their fleets just in case, but deep down, everyone in that room knew they were no longer in control, far away in a quiet ship orbiting a small moon. Captain Mara Ellis sat in her quarters reading the message she had sent back to the council days earlier. The humans had surrounded her ship near Titan Reach, but they had not attacked. Not a single shot was fired, and yet she felt more afraid than she had ever felt in her life. She remembered how hundreds of human ships had appeared from the shadows, silent and still, their dark hulls glowing faintly under the sun. She could feel their power and their patience. It was not the behavior of a race preparing for war. It was the calm of people who no longer needed to prove anything. She had sent her message to the council, and now she waited for orders, but none had come. She stood up and looked through the window at the empty planet below and thought that she might be looking at the future of the whole galaxy. Empty and quiet on the horizon. Dawn Commander Elise Carter received new orders from Earth. The message was short and clear. Continue observation, maintain. Silence, do not engage. She read it 3 times, then deleted it from the terminal. She knew what it meant. Earth had made its final decision. There would be no return to the council. No apology, no talks. Humanity was now on its own. She walked down the narrow hall of the ship and looked at her crew. They were calm, but she could feel the same fire inside each of them, the quiet anger of people who had been pushed too far. Lieutenant Ryan Holt came up to her and said that more council ships had been seen on the edge of the radar. She asked how many. He said 3 scout vessels, small and fast. She told him to stay hidden and keep monitoring. He said he wanted to send a message, but she told him not to. Their silence was stronger than any words. He nodded and walked away. She looked at the dark window again and whispered that silence was their new language. President Nathan Briggs sat in a meeting room on Earth with his Security Council. The air smelled of coffee and tension. A large screen showed the latest reports. The Council was moving fleets closer to human space. He asked if there had been any direct threats. One of his generals said not yet, but the buildup was real. Briggs told them to hold position. No one would attack first. The general said that waiting could be dangerous, and Briggs replied that reacting too soon was worse. He said that humans had survived worse storms than this one. He looked around the table at the faces of men and women who had been with him since the beginning. They were tired but loyal. He said that what they were doing was not surrender or rebellion. It was teaching. He said they were teaching the galaxy what it meant to earn respect. And that lesson would not come with missiles but with silence, he said. That silence would echo louder than explosions. Across the galaxy, panic began to grow. Trade routes were collapsing. Worlds that relied on human goods started to ration supplies. There were shortages of medicines, of materials, of energy, cells many of which were made only by human companies. Pirates began to raid trade lines and border skirmishes broke out between member species. The Council tried to control the situation, but without human cooperation, it was like trying to hold water in their hands. Admiral Sereth told Zorak that the collapse had begun, and that soon chaos would follow. Zorak refused to believe it, and said they still had power, but Laren said power was not the same as trust, and that trust was what humans had given them and now taken away. His words echoed through the chamber, but no one wanted to listen. On Titan Reach, Captain Mara Ellis prepared to leave. She ordered her crew to set course for the Council homeworld, but before she could start the jump engines, her sensors picked up a transmission. It was coming from one of the human ships. She told the crew to open it, but the sound that came through was not a voice. It was a single tone, repeating again and again, slow and steady. She asked her communications officer what it meant, but the system could not translate it. Then she realized it was not meant to be translated. It was a signal to show that they were watching her every move. Her officer asked if they should respond. She said no and told him to record it. She stared at the screen for a long time and whispered that humans had found a new way to speak without words. She felt small and humbled and afraid, because she knew the Council would not understand this message. In deep space, Elise Carter watched as the scout ships from the Council drifted near the edge of the sensor range. They did not cross into human territory, but they stayed close. She told Ryan to monitor their movements. One of the scouts tried to send a message to them, but she ordered silence. Ryan said it felt wrong to just ignore them. She said sometimes ignoring was the answer. The scout ships hovered for hours, then turned away and left. Elise stood still and said that they would come back with more next time. Ryan asked what they would do. Then she said they would still do nothing because humans had already made their choice. He said that choice might lead to war. She said maybe, but at least it would be their own choice. Back on Syraxis Prime, the Council received Mara Ellis's report, and the news spread quickly. The delegates whispered in fear. Admiral Sereth demanded immediate mobilization of fleets. Zorak agreed and called for a full alert, but Laren stood and said that fighting would only prove the humans right. He said they would show that they had learned nothing. Zorak shouted that silence was the same as war, and Laren answered that silence was the sound of dignity lost. The chamber went quiet as everyone stared at him. He said the humans had once believed in unity, and now the Council had made them believe in isolation. He said they had chosen silence because words had become useless. He said they had not rejected peace. They had rejected control. The Council leader turned away without answering because he knew deep inside that every word was true. In the night sky above Earth, the lights of the human fleet shimmered in orbit. Thousands of ships lined in formation, their engines glowing like stars. Humanity stood ready not to attack but to defend their home and their right to choose their own path. Elise Carter sent her final report to command. It said, "Borders secure, no contact, no loss, morale strong, She looked at the stars and wondered what the council was thinking right now. Maybe they were arguing, maybe they were afraid. Maybe they finally understood that silence was the one thing they could not control. She thought of her father again, and his words about peace being the best shield. She smiled, sadly, and said to herself that peace had turned into a wall, and that wall now separated humanity from the rest of the galaxy. And for the first time in history, humans did not feel small in the universe. They felt free. And so the galaxy turned while humans stayed quiet. Every system, every planet, every ambassador waited for the sound of the human voice to return, but it did not come. And the silence of Earth spread through the stars like a slow-growing storm that no one could stop, and every world in the council began to ask the same question: what happens to the universe when the humans stop talking? The Galactic Council chamber was no longer the place of calm discussion. It once was the great hall that had once echoed with proud speeches and diplomatic words, now sounded like a market full of noise and fear. Delegates shouted over one another, while translator drones buzzed in confusion. The walls of the chamber reflected their voices back like a storm inside a glass box. Zorak of the Valar Dominion stood at the center, his deep voice cutting through the noise as he demanded immediate military action against humanity. He said that humans had abandoned diplomacy and that their silence was an act of war. Laren of the Threx Collective tried to speak, but Zorak ignored him and continued saying that if they did not act now, humans would strike first. Admiral Sereth supported him, saying that human ships were growing in number near the border, and that if they waited any longer, they might lose their chance to control the situation. Laren raised his hand and spoke softly, saying that humans had not attacked anyone, that they had withdrawn from the galaxy. Peacefully, he said that calling silence war would make them the aggressors, but his words were drowned by fear. The council voted, and by the end of the session, fleets were ordered to mobilize near human space far from the council chamber. Commander Elise Carter sat in the command chair of the Horizon Dawn, her eyes fixed on the display showing the movements of council fleets. Hundreds of ships from different species were gathering near the borderlines, forming what they called a defense perimeter, but everyone knew it was a threat. Ryan Holt stood beside her reading the data. He said that the council was scared, and Elise nodded, saying fear made people dangerous. He asked if Earth would respond, and she said Earth had already responded with silence. He looked at her confused, and she said that silence was the message. They would not be bullied anymore. She turned to the communication officer and asked for updates. There were none. Every human fleet stayed quiet. Every channel was closed. The only sound was the hum of the engines and the faint rhythm of the air systems. She walked to the observation deck and looked out at the stars, thinking about how strange it was that peace felt so much like waiting for war. On Earth, President Nathan Briggs received reports from the intelligence network. The council had started moving their fleets and was preparing for what they called preventive security. He sat in his office listening in silence while his aides spoke one after another, telling him about the rising panic across the galaxy trade, collapsing food shortages, rising small wars breaking out in the outer colonies. He asked if any of those conflicts involved humans. The aides said no. Humans had withdrawn completely. Briggs smiled, but it was not a happy smile. He said that the galaxy was finally learning how much it needed, what it had taken for granted. He said that for years the council had used humanity's strength and kindness without respect, and now they were paying for it. Alan Pierce asked if they should reopen communication. Briggs said no. He said that silence was the teacher, and that the council had not yet learned its lesson. He looked out the window at the night sky and whispered that sometimes the best way to be heard was to stop speaking. In the outer system near Jupiter, a massive station called Haven 1 served as the main coordination hub for human fleets. Engineers worked day and night maintaining ships and recalibrating defense grids, but there was no rush, no panic. Everything was done with calm precision, as if everyone already knew what would happen before it happened. Commander Elise Carter arrived in her shuttle to attend a strategic meeting with other fleet commanders. When she entered the room, the air was heavy but steady. Every officer stood and greeted her quietly. Admiral Sean Grayson, the senior fleet leader, welcomed her and said they would not discuss attack plans, only readiness. He said the goal was to make sure that if the council made a move, humanity could stand firm. He said they were not planning to invade. They were planning to endure. Elise listened and agreed. She said, that their silence had already done more damage to the Council than any weapon could. Grayson said that the galaxy did not understand silence. They only understood control, and that was why they were afraid, he said. Fear made people dangerous, and they must be ready. Elise said they were ready and always had been. Back on Syraxis Prime. Laren walked through the long corridor of the Council building, his steps slow and heavy. He had tried to reason with them, but no one listened. Fear had made them blind. When he looked out the high window, he could see the stars glowing over the city, each one a reminder of how small they were. He thought about the humans and wondered what they were thinking right now. He had always admired them, even when others called them reckless. He admired their curiosity, their courage, their spirit of cooperation. He remembered when the humans first came to the Council years ago, how they offered to share technology and medicine, how they spoke about unity and peace, how they looked at the galaxy with hope. Now that hope had been broken by arrogance, he whispered to himself that maybe the humans had never been the problem. Maybe the Council had been too proud to see its own weakness in the Great Council. The tension broke when a messenger drone arrived carrying a direct transmission from the human ambassador Daniel Ross. The same man who had left weeks ago. Everyone fell silent as the hologram came to life. His face appeared calm, but his eyes were cold. He said that humanity had watched and listened for too long. He said that the Council had spoken about peace while building walls of control. He said that humans had asked for fairness and had been treated as servants. He said that diplomacy had become a chain, and humanity had decided to break it. He said that Earth would not attend any more meetings and would not obey any more rules of the Council. He said that humans would protect their borders and would trade only with those who respected them. He said this was not war, this was withdrawal. He paused and looked straight at Zorak, saying that if the Council tried to force them back under control, humanity would defend itself. He ended the message by saying that humans had not abandoned peace, they had only refused to beg for it. Then the hologram faded and the chamber stayed silent for a long time. Zorak stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Admiral Sareth turned away and muttered that the humans were dangerous. Laren looked at them both and said softly that maybe dangerous was the wrong word. Maybe humans were simply free. But no one answered him. The chamber was filled with quiet that seemed heavier than any argument outside the window. The city lights flickered and the sky above Syraxis Prime seemed darker than before. The Council had wanted a response and now they had one. But it was not the kind they expected. They had wanted fear or surrender. They received calm defiance. On Hake, the horizon dawn. Elise Carter listened to the transmission replayed across the secure fleet channel. She smiled faintly as she heard Daniel Ross's words and felt pride fill her chest. Ryan Holt asked what they would do next. She said they would do nothing because they had already done enough. She said the Council would now turn on itself, and they would watch. Ryan asked if she really thought the Council would fall apart. She said yes, because they had built their empire on control. And without control it would crumble. She said that was what always happened when power forgot respect. She looked out the window and whispered that humans had not rejected diplomacy. They had only rejected the arrogance that came with it. Across the galaxy, the signs of collapse began. Small but spread fast. Planets under Council protection started to rebel. Trade unions split into factions. Fleets refused to follow orders. Zorak tried to control them, but his commands were ignored. Admiral Sareth prepared his ships for battle but had no enemy to fight. Laren watched everything unfold and said to himself that the humans had won without firing a shot. He said they had changed the galaxy by leaving it, and he wondered if any of them understood how much power that kind of silence truly held on Earth. Nathan Briggs stood again at his window watching the dawn rise over the horizon. The city below was calm. The people went about their lives knowing that somewhere beyond the stars, their fleet stood. Gardy smiled and said softly that humanity had done what it always did when pushed too far. It stood tall and walked alone. He said the Council would learn that respect was not given. It was earned. And if it took the silence of a whole species to teach that lesson, then so be it. He turned away from the window and walked out of the room, leaving the light of morning to fill the space behind him. And so the humans stayed quiet and the galaxy trembled. Because silence had become their greatest weapon and the council that once ruled over them began to crumble from the inside, while humanity stood at the edge of the stars watching and waiting not with anger, but with calm and certainty, knowing that they had finally become free. The stars above Earth glowed softly in the cold silence of space as the human fleet moved slowly around the planet. The horizon dawn drifted near the edge of the orbit, its hull shining under the sun. Elise Carter stood on the observation deck watching. The reflection of light across the panels, she felt calm but also heavy. She knew something had changed forever. The council had not responded for days. No new messages, no threats, no demands, only silence. Ryan Holt came to her side holding a tablet. With reports, he said that the council fleets had stopped moving, that many had returned to their home systems, that trade routes were broken and colonies were refusing orders. Elise nodded and said it had begun. Ryan asked what she meant, and she said the fall of the council. She said it would not happen in one day, but it had already started, and that was enough. She turned back to the window and whispered that silence had done what war never could. On Siraxis Prime, the great council chamber looked empty. Most of the seats were vacant, and those who remained sat in tired silence. Jorak stood near the center, but his voice was no longer strong. He spoke about unity, but no one listened. Admiral Sareth had left days ago, taking his fleets back to his homeworld. Laren sat quietly near the back, reading reports of rebellion and unrest across council space. Dozens of colonies had declared independence planets, once ruled by fear, now declared freedom without asking permission. The trade guilds had cut communication and refused to pay taxes. The council treasury was nearly empty. Jorak slammed his fist on the table and shouted that the humans had done this with their silence, that their refusal to speak had broken the order of the galaxy. Laren looked at him and said softly that maybe order built on control was never true. Order. Zorak turned toward him and said that humans were dangerous, that they had planned this from the start. Laren shook his head and said that humans had not planned anything, they had simply walked away, and the council had destroyed itself by trying to hold on to something it never understood. Back on Earth, President Nathan Briggs stood before the World Council of Nations, his expression calm. The room was filled with leaders from every continent watching him closely. He spoke about the future, saying that the age of dependence was over. He said that humanity would not return to the Galactic Council, and that the silence would continue until the galaxy learned respect. He said they would still help those who came in peace, but they would not serve anyone ever again. He said that humans had built their future with their own hands once, and could do it again. He spoke of new colonies, outside council borders, new research programs, new fleets not for conquest but for defense and exploration. He said that the stars were open again, but this time they would walk among them as equals, not as followers. The room was silent when he finished, and then one by one the leaders stood and applauded. It was not a sound of pride. It was a sound of unity. In deep space near the old borderline, a group of council ships drifted damaged and without command. Their captains argued over what to do. Some wanted to attack humans, others wanted to surrender, but no one knew who to obey. The council signal beacon had gone dark. The main communication hub on Siraxis Prime had been destroyed in a protest riot. One of the younger captains, named Varek, watched, his screen showing human patrol ships nearby, but they did not attack. They simply passed in silence. Their presence was enough to make his crew nervous. He realized that humans were not the threat. The threat was the fear they had left behind. Ordered his crew to stand down and said that they would return home and rebuild without the council. His officers stared at him in disbelief but obeyed. He looked once more at the human ships and said quietly that maybe freedom had always belonged to those who dared to be alone. Meanwhile, on the horizon dawn, Elise received word from Earth that President Briggs had approved new exploration missions. She felt a sense of pride, knowing humanity was moving forward. She called her officers and told them that their mission was changing. They were no longer border patrol, they were pioneers. She said that they would travel beyond known space to find new worlds, new life, and new hope. Ryan Holt smiled and said that maybe the galaxy would one day ask them to return. Elise said maybe, but if that day came, they would return only as equals. She looked around the room at her crew, their faces bright with quiet strength. They had faced fear, rejection, and silence, and now they were stronger for it far. Away on Syraxis Prime. Laren walked alone through the empty streets. The city was dark and quiet, once filled with life and pride. Now it felt like a ghost world. He saw the council banners torn and lying in the dust. He picked one up and folded it, slowly, then looked to the stars above. He whispered that maybe the humans were right. Maybe diplomacy had become a chain, not a bridge. He thought of Daniel Ross, the human ambassador who had once stood in the chamber with hope in his eyes. He remembered how Ross spoke about peace that came from respect, not power. Laren realized too late that they should have listened. He decided to leave the city and join one of the new independent coalitions that sought peace without control. He would try to rebuild, something new from the ruins, something the humans could look at one day and say it was worth saving. Daniel Ross sat in a quiet cabin on a transport ship heading toward Mars. He had refused to return to the council. When the message arrived asking for talks again, the new message was polite, humble even. It said they wished to restore relations, but Daniel deleted it without reading further. He had seen enough of their lies. He stared out the window at the red planet growing larger as they approached. He thought about all that had happened, about how silence had done what no speech or treaty could do. He thought about how humans had changed the balance of the galaxy simply by saying no. He smiled faintly and said that sometimes peace needed distance. Sometimes to be understood, one had to walk away. On Earth, people began to rebuild not just cities or ships, but the way they saw themselves for years. They had looked to the council for approval. Now they looked to each other. They built schools that taught about the stars and also about respect. They sent missions to help worlds that had broken away from the council, but only if asked. They shared technology freely with those who came in honesty. They did not rule. They guided from afar. Humanity had become a symbol of strength through restraint, of wisdom through silence, and across the stars that silence echoed, like a lesson written in light. Months passed, and the council finally dissolved, unable to hold together the weight of its own fear and pride. New alliances formed, but none with the old arrogance. The galaxy had changed. Laren joined a small union of free worlds that sought peace through equality. Their first act was to send a message to Earth, not demanding, not begging, but simply thanking humanity for showing them a better way. The message reached President Briggs, who read it quietly in his office and smiled. He sent back a single line saying, "We are listening." And for the first time in a long time, those words carried real meaning in orbit. The horizon dawn prepared for its next journey. Elise Carter stood once more at the observation window watching the stars. Ryan Holt asked where they were going. She said they would go wherever there was light. He asked what if there was only darkness. She smiled and said, then they would bring their own. She looked out one last time before the engines ignited and whispered that silence had given them freedom, and that freedom had given them purpose. The ship turned slowly and began to move forward, disappearing into the black sea of stars, leaving behind the echoes of a lesson that would shape the galaxy for centuries to come. A lesson that power built on fear fades, but power built on respect endures. And as the stars stretched into lines, the humans departed not in anger but in peace, carrying with them the quiet strength of those who had finally found their own voice.